The night air hung heavy with frost along the Kansas City rail yard, the kind of cold that cut bone deep and carried silence like a weapon. Only the distant wail of a freight train broke it, long and metallic, echoing off the steel warehouses that loomed over the empty lots. On the tracks themselves, Officer Jack Reynolds lay shackled, wrists pinned cruelly behind his back, iron biting into skin already torn from a beating. His face was streaked with blood, one eye nearly swollen shut. Every shallow breath reminded him of cracked ribs. Beside him, in a wicker basket too fragile for the world it had been thrust into, a newborn wailed. The child's thin cries pierced the night, each one rising higher as the ground began to tremble. The vibration crawled through the rails, humming up into Jack's spine. He twisted, straining to shield the infant with his body, though the cuffs cut deeper with every move. He remembered the betrayal that landed him here. An informant, a whispered lead on a child trafficking ring. He'd followed into a back alley near the yard, only to be ambushed by 4 men. Fists, chains. A voice against his ear, low and mocking. "This is what happens when you get too close." Then darkness, and when he woke this, dumped on cold steel, left to die with an innocent. Now the train horn howled again, closer, a scream of iron promising an end that neither he nor the baby deserved. Jack clenched his teeth, tasting blood, rage, and despair twisting in his chest. He could not let this be his last case, his last breath. Out of the darkness beyond the service road came the sharp rhythm of paws hitting gravel. Then a child's voice, small but clear. "Rexy, what is it?" The German shepherd burst into view first, a streak of black and tan muscle and focus. His amber eyes flared in the rail yard's dim light. Every line of his body was tension, but not fear. He barked once, sharp as a command. Behind him, a girl stumbled forward, 9 years old at most, hair tangled in uneven waves, a faded pink dress hanging in tatters. Dirt streaked her face, but her gaze didn't falter when she saw the man and baby on the tracks. Jack's voice was hoarse but urgent. "Get back! The train's coming!" But the girl's eyes snapped to the basket, to the infant's flailing fists. She dropped her patched backpack, hands trembling as she turned to Jack. "What do I do?" Rexy didn't wait. The shepherd ran to the cuffs, jaws snapping around the iron, tugging and pawing with instinct sharpened by survival. He growled, low and furious, as if the steel itself were the enemy. Jack forced his words out through pain. "Left cuff, there's a latch. You need to pull it up. Hurry!" The girl dropped to her knees. Her small fingers scraped against blood and cold steel. She bit her lip, fighting tears, as the train's rumble grew louder. Her nails caught the latch once, slipped, then caught again. The click of it springing free was like thunder. Jack yanked one arm loose, ignoring the fire in his muscles. "The baby, move the baby, now!" She grabbed the basket handles. It was heavier than she expected, her thin arms straining, but she dragged it off the rails inch by inch. The infant wailed louder, the sound nearly swallowed by the roar of the train. "The other cuff!" Jack barked. She lunged again, fumbling in panic. The train horn blasted so loud it rattled her chest. Her breath hitched, eyes wide, but Rexy shoved his head against her shoulder, barking in her ear. "Finish it." She pulled, metal slicing her fingertips, and the latch sprang free. Jack rolled, throwing himself over the gravel, chains clattering. He scooped the basket into his chest just as the train barreled past. The force was a storm dust, heat, shrieking wheels tearing the night apart. Jack curled around the baby, body pressed into the gravel. The girl flattened beside him, clutching Rexy's fur, her face buried in his coat. The shepherd stayed upright, barking furiously at the monster of steel and light as if he could fight it off himself. When the last car screamed by, silence fell like a curtain. Only ragged breathing and the hiccuping cries of the infant remained. Jack opened his eyes slowly. The baby was warm against him. Alive. Relief surged through him so hard it made his vision blur. He looked at the girl, still gripping Rexy with white knuckles. "You saved us," he rasped. She shook her head fast, pressing her cheek to the shepherd's neck. "He saved you." Rexy always knows the dog wagged his tail once, steady and deliberate, his eyes locked on Jack like a soldier awaiting orders. For the first time that night, Jack let out a breath that wasn't just survival, it was gratitude. He sat up, cradling the infant tighter. "What's your name?" "Emma," the girl said softly. "Emma Collins." Jack nodded, grounding himself in the truth of his own name. "Jack Reynolds, Kansas City Police." He swallowed hard, then pointed down the service road. "There's a phone 2 blocks that way. Call 911. Tell them an officer is injured and a newborn's been found. Take Rexy with you." "Stay in the light," Emma hesitated. "What about you?" Jack forced a faint smile, even as blood seeped down his arm. "I'll manage." "Go." She nodded once, then sprinted, Rexy bounding at her side like a shadow with teeth. Jack watched them vanish into the dark, then tightened his hold on the infant. The tracks were empty again, but inside him something burned. They had survived tonight. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The horn of the freight train grew louder, its scream cutting across the night until it rattled every loose piece of steel in the rail yard. Jack Reynolds could feel the vibration crawl up through the tracks into his bones. His chest tightened with each second, his ribs screaming from the strain as he curled tighter around the infant. Emma dropped to her knees beside him, her small hands slick with blood as she fought the stubborn metal of the cuffs. The girl's breath came in sharp gasps, her hair falling across her face. She bit back tears, forcing herself not to freeze. Rexy stayed pressed against her side, his body braced like a living anchor. The shepherd snarled at the chains, then lunged forward to sink his teeth around the cold iron. He pulled with raw strength, his muscles quivering, eyes blazing with urgency. "Focus on the latch," Jack rasped. His throat burned with the effort, his voice nearly drowned by the roar of the train bearing down on them. Emma's fingers slipped once more, nails scraping against metal. She whimpered, but Rexy barked at her, sharp and commanding. It was more than a sound, it was an order. She blinked, steadied her trembling hands, and pushed harder at the tiny groove. Suddenly, it gave way with a loud click. Jack's right arm snapped free. Pain shot up his shoulder, but he rolled hard, twisting his body to shield the basket as best he could. His free hand closed around the infant's blanket, pulling it closer. "Other one!" he barked, fighting against panic. Emma scrambled to the second cuff. The train's light exploded across the tracks now, a blinding beam that turned their faces pale. The ground shook violently. The horn shrieked so loud it felt like it would split her skull. She froze for a heartbeat. Then Rexy shoved her forward with his head, his growl reverberating in her chest. Emma snapped back, dug her nails into the latch. The cuff sprang open. Jack didn't waste the second he was given. He tore himself off the tracks, grabbed the basket with his good arm, and rolled into the gravel just as the engine thundered past. The noise was apocalyptic, the heat of it washing over their bodies, dust and sparks stinging their skin. Emma was thrown sideways by the rush of air. Rexy caught her shirt collar in his teeth, dragging her down into the gravel and pinning her with his weight until the last car screamed by. Together they lay pressed to the earth as the train roared above them, an unstoppable monster of steel and fire. When silence finally fell, it was heavier than the roar had been. Jack lay panting, every nerve alight with pain, but the baby still cried in his arms. Alive. That sound, thin, desperate, alive, sent a flood of relief so strong his eyes burned. Emma lifted her head slowly, dirt streaking her cheeks, eyes wide. She looked at Jack, then the infant, then at Rexy, who stood over them like a sentry, hackles raised, ears forward, scanning the darkness for any further threats. His chest heaved, his teeth still bared, as if daring the night to try again. Jack forced himself upright, his muscles trembling with effort. He shifted the baby against his chest, pressing a bloodied hand to its tiny back. He could feel the life there, fragile but insistent. "You're safe," he whispered hoarsely. "You're safe." Emma stumbled closer, her knees scraped raw, her hands trembling. She touched the edge of the basket, her eyes locked on the baby. Is he okay?" Jack nodded once, his voice still gravel. "Crying means strong." Rexy moved closer, sniffed the infant gently, then looked up at Jack with an unblinking stare. It wasn't just curiosity. It was as if the shepherd was asking what came next, demanding orders like any true partner. Jack exhaled shakily, then focused on Emma. "Listen to me. Down the road, 2 blocks, there's a payphone with a busted light. It still works if you hit it right. Call 911. Tell them an officer is down and there's a newborn in danger. Take Rexy with you. Stay in the light." "Don't stop," Emma's lip trembled. "What about you?" Jack tightened his grip on the child, his face pale but steady. "I'll manage." Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment she looked far older than 9. Then she nodded, wiped her nose with the back of her hand, and turned. "Go," Jack said, his voice firm despite the pain. Emma grabbed her backpack and sprinted down the gravel path. Rexy bolted after her, then stopped, looking back at Jack. For a heartbeat, man and dog locked eyes. Jack lifted his chin in silent command. "Protect her." Rexy gave a short, low bark, then wheeled and ran, his body a dark streak beside the girl. Jack watched them disappear into the night. Alone again, he shifted the baby against his chest, rocking gently to calm its cries. The faint wail steadied, softer now, as if even the infant knew the storm had passed for tonight. But Jack knew better. The train had missed them by seconds. The men who had put him there would not stop so easily. He sat in the gravel, chest rising and falling, heart hammering against his ribs, and promised himself the truth. This fight was only beginning. The world returned to Jack Reynolds in fragments beeping monitors, the steady hiss of oxygen, the antiseptic bite of hospital air. He blinked against fluorescent light until the ceiling came into focus. Pain announced itself everywhere, ribs bound tight, wrists raw under layers of bandage, a deep ache behind his eyes. But pain meant he was still alive. His thoughts splintered back to the tracks, the horn of the train, the infant's cries, Emma's trembling hands, Rexy's growl cutting through panic. It replayed in flashes until the sound of a door opening pulled him out. Emma stood in the doorway, dwarfed by a grey hoodie that nearly swallowed her frame. Her brown hair was brushed, tied into lopsided pigtails, freckles stark against pale skin. Rexy padded behind her, coat brushed, but ear still notched from old battles. The shepherd's amber eyes swept the room before he settled at Jack's bedside, massive head resting on the mattress like a soldier standing guard. "You found me," Jack said, his voice a rasp. Emma stepped closer, sneakers squeaking on tile. "I told the nurse I knew you." She said 5 minutes. Her voice was small but steady. She held something in her hands and set it on his palm, a frayed handkerchief embroidered with a crooked daisy. Jack frowned. "What's this?" "My lucky scarf," she said firmly. "You'll need it next time." Her chin trembled as she added, "You almost didn't make it." Jack swallowed, closing his hand over the fabric. "Thank you." He turned to Rexy, who rumbled low, a sound that carried weight rather than menace. Jack reached out with his unbandaged hand, brushing the shepherd's head. The dog leaned into the touch, solid and grounding. The door opened again. A woman in blue scrubs entered, her steps brisk but not harsh. Nurse Carla Lopez. Early 40s, her olive-toned face lined by long nights and harder days. She checked the IV at his arm, then gave him a look that was equal parts stern and relieved. "Officer Reynolds," she said, "you're lucky to be here." Concussion, broken ribs, dehydration. A few more minutes on those tracks and we'd be having a different conversation. Jack managed a dry half-smile. "I've never been good at taking time off." Carla shook her head, muttering under her breath about stubborn men, before turning to Emma. "5 minutes, sweetheart, then you need to wait outside." "Yes, Mom," Emma whispered. Carla left, closing the door softly. Silence returned, broken only by the steady beep of monitors. Jack studied Emma, her shoulders too tight for a child, her eyes carrying something practiced. He saw the same marks of hardship he'd seen in children forced to grow up too soon. "You saved us," he said quietly. "You and Rexy. Without you, that baby, without you, me, we wouldn't be here." Emma shook her head fast, pressing her face into Rexy's fur. "I didn't think. I heard him crying, and Rexy wouldn't stop barking." Jack nodded slowly, shifting despite the pain, and rested a hand on her arm. "You're braver than most adults I've met." Rexy's tail thudded once against the bed, as if agreeing. The dog pressed his muzzle closer, eyes locked on Jack with a fierce steadiness. It was a vow, silent but undeniable. Before Jack could say more, a faint cry carried down the hallway. Not Emma's, not anyone in the room, the sound of an infant. The baby. Jack's breath caught. "Where is he?" Jack asked. Emma pointed toward the east wing. "The nursery. They said he's okay." Relief flickered through Jack, but it burned into something sharper. He remembered the ambush, the mocking voice. "This wasn't random," he muttered. Emma's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Jack's gaze hardened. "They didn't just want me dead. They wanted that baby gone." He looked at her, then at Rexy, who had lifted his head as though he understood. "Whoever's behind this isn't finished." As if on cue, Rexy growled low, ears swiveling towards the window. Jack stiffened, instincts sparking even through the pain. "Emma," he said, his voice tight, "close the curtain." She obeyed without hesitation. Jack leaned back, fighting against the weight in his chest. Somewhere out there, eyes were still watching. The men who chained him to the tracks wouldn't stop because a train missed its mark. Jack let his head sink against the pillow, his jaw clenched. He wasn't just healing, he was preparing. The baby's cries in his memory, Emma's courage, Rexy's loyalty. None of it would be wasted. The war wasn't over. It had only begun. By the 3rd day in the hospital, Jack Reynolds was restless. The doctors wanted him flat on his back, but every fiber of his body screamed to move. He'd been ambushed, chained to the tracks like trash, left to die beside a newborn. He couldn't lie here pretending the world outside wasn't burning. The only thing that settled him was the steady presence of Rexy, stretched out on the floor at the foot of his bed, amber eyes alert even when his body rested. And Emma, perched in the visitor's chair, pencil scratching across a borrowed notepad. She was quiet, too quiet for a child her age, but there was something about the way she sat there, like she belonged in the room, as if she had been part of his life longer than 3 nights. "What are you drawing?" Jack asked finally. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Emma looked up. For the first time, he noticed her hands thin, calloused in odd places for a 9-year-old. She turned the pad toward him. On the page were a series of chalk-like symbols, circles, arrows, slashes. They looked like nonsense to him, crude graffiti. Jack frowned. "Street art?" Emma shook her head. "Signs. For kids like me, The air shifted. Jack pushed himself up despite the pull of stitches along his ribs. "What kind of signs?" Emma hesitated, chewing the inside of her cheek, then pointed at one of the sketches. A circle with a line cutting through. "This means no good. Bad place. Stay away." She tapped another, a triangle with 2 dots. "Safe spot. You can sleep a night there." Jack stared. These weren't doodles. They were maps, warnings etched into alleyways, underpasses, places no patrol officer ever thought to look. "How do you know this?" Emma's gaze flicked to Rexy, then back. "Because no one else was going to keep me safe. You learn fast when you don't have a choice." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her shoulders tensed as if waiting for judgment. Jack swallowed. The thought of her wandering Kansas City's back streets alone, relying on coded chalk marks to know where she could breathe, tightened his chest more than his broken ribs ever could. He looked at her again, really looked, and saw the resilience carved into her frame. Rexy lifted his head, chuffed once, and pushed his nose against Emma's hand. She scratched his ear automatically, eyes softening. It wasn't just comfort. The dog was grounding her, reminding her she wasn't alone anymore. Jack cleared his throat. "Emma, those marks, would you recognize them again, if you saw more?" She nodded slowly. "They're not just for kids. Sometimes bad men use them too, to mark drop-offs, or who controls what street that hit Jack like a jolt." He thought back to the baby in the basket, the mocking voice in the alley. Could these marks be threads to pull on? Before he could ask more, Nurse Carla stepped in with her clipboard. She glanced between Jack and Emma, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You're pushing too hard," she told Jack. "Ribs like yours don't heal with pacing." Jack gave her a thin smile. "I've got a stubborn streak." Carla sighed. "That girl and that dog, they're calmer than you. Maybe listen to them for once." She scribbled on her chart, then left, muttering about men who never sat still. When the door shut, Emma giggled softly. The sound was quick, fragile, but real. "She's right, you know." Jack leaned back, exhaling. "Don't get used to it." For a while, silence settled over the room again. Rexy shifted closer to Jack's bed, resting his chin on the mattress. Jack stroked the shepherd's head absent-mindedly, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the fur. This wasn't just a pet. This was a partner. "Emma," Jack said finally, his voice quieter. "The men who left me on those tracks, they won't stop. If they're tied to the symbols you know, then maybe you and Rexy are the only chance I have of finding them again." Her eyes widened. "You want me to help?" "I want us to help each other," Jack said. "I've got training, a badge, and resources. You've got knowledge I never would have seen. And Rexy—" He glanced down at the dog, who stared back with unflinching loyalty. "Rexy sees what neither of us can." Emma sat straighter, her notepad pressed to her chest. For the first time, there was a spark in her eyes, a sense of belonging. She looked at Rexy, who gave a single wag of his tail, then back to Jack. "Okay," she said firmly, "but we do it together." Jack extended his hand, palm open. Emma hesitated, then slid her small hand into his. Rexy leaned in, pressing his muzzle against their clasped fingers. For a moment, the sterile hospital room faded. It wasn't officer, orphan, and dog anymore. It was something else entirely. A unit. A family forged by survival. Jack closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of that bond settle in his chest. He knew the road ahead was darker than either of them could imagine, but with Emma's street-born instincts and Rexy's unwavering loyalty, he wasn't walking it alone. Not anymore. By the time Jack Reynolds was cleared to walk more than a block without wincing, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. The men who chained him to the tracks weren't ghosts, They left marks, trails, shadows, and now he had allies who could see what he had missed before. Kansas City's industrial edge had always been a patchwork of boarded warehouses and rail yards, a place where noise swallowed questions and graffiti told the only stories. Jack had walked those streets for years as a cop, but with Emma and Rexy at his side, he began to see things differently. Emma led the way down a narrow alley, her sneakers crunching over broken glass. She stopped at a wall tagged with a faded circle and 2 slashes. To Jack, it looked like careless vandalism. To Emma, it was a warning. "This one," she said, running her finger over the chalk lines. "It means stay out." "But not for kids like me." "For them?" Jack asked. "The ones who take babies." "They use marks, too." To tell each other where to go, her voice was matter-of-fact, but her hands trembled slightly at the edges. Rexy pressed his nose close to the wall, inhaling deeply, then gave a sharp bark, spinning to look down the alley as if confirming her words. Jack's jaw tightened. "Show me more." They moved through the maze of warehouses, following Emma's careful eye. Some marks were half erased, others newly drawn, arrows carved into brick, symbols hidden under layers of paint. Rexy guided them with his nose, pausing at doorways, hackles rising when the air carried faint traces of formula or disinfectant. At one abandoned loading dock, Rexy stopped cold. His body stiffened, ears pricked, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Jack followed his gaze. A wooden crate sat shoved against the wall, almost invisible in the shadows. Jack heaved it aside, ignoring the stab of pain in his ribs, and found scraps of a torn hospital blanket, stained with milk and something darker. Emma covered her mouth. "Like the baby on the tracks," she whispered. Jack's stomach dropped. This was a drop site. The trail grew heavier the deeper they went. Emma's notepad filled with quick sketches of the symbols, her handwriting cramped but determined. Jack took photos with his phone, but it was Rexy who truly guided them. The shepherd moved like he was back on patrol, nose low, tail rigid, every muscle alive with focus. He wasn't sniffing for food or stray animals. He was hunting the truth. By dusk, they reached an old brick house slouched against a weed-choked lot. The windows were covered with boards, but faint light seeped through the cracks. Rexy froze at the threshold, then circled the door twice before sitting heavily, ears back. He didn't bark this time. He didn't need to. His silence was more telling. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of antiseptic and sour milk. Dust floated like mist, disturbed only by the beam of Jack's flashlight. A crib stood in the corner, its mattress stained, its springs broken. On the wall, faint symbols stretched like scars, arrows, circles, and one mark Emma didn't recognize. "This one's different," she murmured, tracing it with her fingertip. Jack crouched beside her. The mark resembled a crude cross, slashed through with a jagged line. "What does it mean?" Emma shook her head. "Not for kids." "For someone else," a voice behind them answered. "For the broker." Jack spun, Glock raised, but the figure in the doorway wasn't a thug. She was an older woman, late 60s, thin but tall, her face worn and pale. She wore a cardigan 2 sizes too big, slippers frayed at the toes. Her grey hair was pulled into a messy bun, strands falling loose around her hollow eyes. "My name's Martha Green," she said, her voice dry as paper. "I was a nurse once. I know what you're looking for." Emma pressed against Rexy, who stepped in front of her, a protective wall of fur and muscle. Jack didn't lower his weapon. "Then talk." Martha's hands trembled as she lifted them. "I fed them." "The babies. I wrapped them in blankets, gave them bottles. I told myself it was better than nothing, that at least someone cared for them before—" Her voice cracked. She looked down at the floor. "But I knew. I knew where they were going." Emma's eyes narrowed, sharp beyond her years. Then why didn't you stop? Martha flinched, the words cutting deeper than any bullet. Because I was afraid. Because they told me if I spoke, I'd disappear too. Jack studied her, his gut torn between fury and recognition. He'd seen this look before in witnesses who lived with guilt too heavy to bury. But before he could speak, Rexy growled, low and deep. His body pivoted toward the boarded window. Jack's instincts flared. He doused his light, signaling Emma to stay low. Outside, the crunch of boots echoed faintly. Shadows shifted against the thin cracks of light. Martha's face went white. They followed me, she whispered. They never let me out of sight. Jack grabbed Emma by the shoulder, pulling her closer, while Rexy positioned himself between them and the window. The dog's teeth flashed in the dim light, every muscle ready to strike. For one suspended moment, silence held. Then a branch snapped outside. Jack's mind raced. They had uncovered more than just symbols now. They were standing on the edge of the trail, and the people hunting them were closer than he'd feared. And Rexy, steady and silent, knew it first. The cabin crouched deep in the woods, its timbers grey with age, moss creeping across the roof like a slow disease. The drive up had been silent. Jack kept one hand on the wheel, the other pressed against his ribs, still aching from the tracks. Emma sat in the passenger seat, backpack clutched to her chest, eyes darting between the trees. In the back, Rexy sat upright, his body rigid, ears swiveling at every sound. Martha Green had led them here, her voice shaking as she gave directions. Now she stood framed in the doorway, her thin figure etched against the weak glow of lamplight inside. You shouldn't have followed me, she muttered, stepping aside. But since you're here, you need to hear the truth. Jack guided Emma inside first, his Glock drawn but lowered. Rexy padded in behind them, nose twitching, tail stiff. The shepherd's presence filled the room more than any weapon could. The interior smelled of wood smoke and antiseptic, the relics of Martha's old life as a nurse scattered across shelves, medical texts, faded syringes, bottles of rubbing alcohol with dust clinging to the glass. She sank into a chair, folding her hands tight in her lap, as if to stop them from trembling. I thought I was helping, she began, her voice brittle. Feeding them, holding them, telling myself it was better they had one kind face before. Her words collapsed into silence. Emma, sitting on the edge of a chair, spoke before Jack could. Before they were sold. Martha flinched as though struck. I told myself I had no choice. Her gaze slid to the floor. But that's the lie that keeps monsters alive, isn't it? Jack leaned forward, his voice sharp but measured. Who runs it? Who put that baby on the tracks with me? Martha's eyes lifted to his. For a heartbeat, she looked 20 years younger, the nurse she once had been. Then her face crumpled. They call him the broker. He decides who takes the children, where they go, how much they're worth. Emma hugged her backpack tighter, freckles standing stark against her pale skin. Do you know where? Martha's lips pressed thin. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of her chair. There's a farmhouse. South of the rail line. Looks abandoned from the road. But it isn't. That's where they keep them before transport. Jack's chest tightened. It was more than he'd gotten from weeks of chasing shadows. Why tell us now? Her eyes filled with tears. Because I see her, she whispered, nodding toward Emma. I had a daughter once. And I let my fear cost her everything. I won't let it happen again. Before Jack could respond, Rexy's entire body shifted. The shepherd rose, stiff-legged, nose flaring. His ears pinned forward, hackles bristling along his spine. A growl built low in his chest, vibrating through the floorboards. Emma startled. What is it? Jack snapped his flashlight off. Darkness pressed in, broken only by the weak glow of the lamp. Outside, a twig cracked. The sound was faint, but Rexy reacted instantly, head swinging toward the boarded window. He growled again, deeper now, teeth flashing in the dim light. "We're not alone," Jack murmured. He motioned Emma to the floor. She slid down, clutching Rexy's flank. The dog stayed rooted, his body between her and the window, his gaze locked on whatever moved beyond the glass. Martha's face drained of color. "They watch me. Always. I thought I'd lost them tonight, but they're here." Her voice trembled, breaking apart. "If I speak, they kill me. If I don't, they kill others." Jack crouched beside the door, weapon ready. His pulse hammered, but his voice stayed level. "Then you're already on their list. Give me everything. Addresses, names. We'll protect you." Martha's breath came fast, shallow. Her hands shook as she scribbled on a scrap of paper directions, a crude map of back roads leading to the farmhouse. She shoved it into Jack's palm. "That's all I know. But it's enough to end them if you're brave enough." Another sound outside. Boots on gravel, the scrape of metal against wood. Rexy lunged toward the door, barking once, sharp and explosive. Jack grabbed Emma's shoulder, pulling her back towards the kitchen. "We need to move." Now Martha stood frozen in the lamplight, her eyes wild. "Go," she urged. "Take the girl. Take the dog. They'll follow me, not you." Use the time Jack hesitated. He'd seen sacrifices before, good people swallowed by fear and violence. But Rexy pressed forward, barking again, snapping his head toward the rear door. The shepherd had made the choice for them. Jack tightened his grip on Emma's hand. "Stay low. Stay with Rexy." They slipped out the back just as shadows moved across the cabin's front window. Emma clung to Rexy's fur, her breath ragged. The dog led them into the trees, his movements silent but sure, every step deliberate. Behind them, the cabin light flickered. A crash echoed as the front door splintered. Martha's voice rose once, sharp and defiant, before it was cut short. Emma stumbled, eyes wide. Jack pulled her along, heart pounding, the scrap of paper burning against his palm. He didn't have the luxury of mourning. Rexy pressed forward into the woods, leading them deeper into darkness. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew survival was ahead, not behind, and Jack knew, as the night swallowed them, that Martha Green had given her last act of courage to push them closer to the broker. Now it was their turn to finish what she had started. The trees pressed close around them as they moved away from Martha Green's cabin, the forest swallowing sound like a conspirator. Jack Reynolds kept one hand on Emma's shoulder, the other gripping his sidearm. Rexy led the way, silent but alert, every step a promise that he would detect danger before it struck. They found shelter in a run-down hunting shack 1/2 mile from the road. The air inside was damp, the roof sagging, but it was cover. Jack eased Emma onto a broken chair, then leaned against the wall, his ribs screaming with every breath. The scrap of paper Martha had given him was still clenched in his fist. Emma pulled her knees to her chest, eyes wide. "They'll kill her, won't they?" she whispered. Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. Rexy paced once around the shack before settling at the doorway, his nose to the gap under the frame, ears pricked. He was guarding, listening, a sentinel in the dark. For Jack, the quiet pressed harder than the pain. His mind dragged him backward, years before Emma, before Rexy, before tonight. Another winter night, another raid. Aurora, Colorado, a suspected trafficking house. He'd been young then, too eager, too sure. They hit the door 10 minutes too late. He remembered the bleach in the air, the silence that followed. And on a cot in the corner, a child wrapped in a blanket. Too still, too cold. Jack had stood frozen, his gloves slick, his chest hollow. He hadn't saved that child. He'd buried the image deep, but it clawed its way back now with brutal clarity. His grip tightened on Martha's map until his knuckles went white. He wanted to believe tonight could be different. He wanted to believe he hadn't lost his edge, but the ghost of that failure pressed down on him, whispering he would fail again. Emma's voice cut through the silence. "You're thinking about something bad." Jack blinked, startled. She studied him with eyes too sharp for a child. "I can tell," she said. "You look the same way I do when I remember things I don't want to." Jack exhaled slowly. "There was another case. A baby I didn't save, his throat tightened. I can't let that happen again." Emma hugged her knees tighter, then spoke with a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any badge. "If we stop now, more babies die." The words hung in the air. Simple. True. Rexy stirred, rising to his feet, as if agreeing. He moved to Jack's side, pressing his massive head against Jack's arm. Jack let his hand rest on the dog's thick coat, feeling the steady warmth. It was more than comfort, it was grounding. Emma shifted closer, her small hand brushing Jack's wrist. "You don't have to do it alone this time," she whispered. Jack looked at her, then at Rexy. For the first time since Aurora, he didn't feel like a man carrying failure. He felt like part of something stronger. Still, the fear gnawed. "This broker, he's not just some street thug. He's organized, protected. Going after him could get us killed." Emma's gaze didn't waver. "So could doing nothing." Rexy gave a sharp bark, sudden and decisive, then moved to the doorway again. His stance was tall, ears forward, tail straight. "Ready." Jack let out a breath that shuddered. He unfolded Martha's paper, the map crude but clear. South of the rail line, an old farmhouse hidden behind abandoned fields. It could be a trap. It probably was. But it was also a chance. He tucked the map into his pocket, then met Emma's eyes. "All right. We finished this." Together, Emma nodded once, a flicker of relief crossing her face. She leaned against Rexy, burying her hand in his fur. The shepherd stood like stone, but his eyes softened, his chest rising steady as a drumbeat. Jack straightened, ignoring the pull of his ribs. The ghosts of the past still lingered, but they no longer had the same grip. Aurora had broken him. But Emma and Rexy, this unlikely family, were forcing him to stand again. And this time, he promised himself, he would not be too late. The warehouse crouched at the edge of the rail yard, its corrugated metal walls stained with rust, a fortress of shadows against the faint glow of the city beyond. Jack Reynolds studied it from behind a stack of pallets, his breath clouding in the cool night air. Every instinct in him screamed that this was it, the place Martha Green's map had pointed to, the place that could break the broker's ring wide open. Beside him, Emma crouched low, her yellow hoodie pulled tight around her thin frame. She held her notepad in one hand. Though the pages fluttered in the breeze, her pencil tucked behind her ear. Her face was pale but steady. In the darkness, she looked older than 9, her jaw set the way only someone who had already survived too much could hold it. Rexy pressed close at her side, his body taut, tail stiff, ears locked forward. The shepherd's silence was louder than a bark. He was reading the warehouse, the wind, the invisible currents of danger that humans missed. Jack whispered, "Once we move, there's no turning back." Emma's answer came without hesitation. "Then let's not waste time." Jack almost smiled, despite the tension clawing at his ribs. Courage in a child was never simple bravado. It was survival sharpened to a blade. He nodded once, then motioned forward. They slipped across the gravel, keeping low, shadows among shadows. Jack eased the side door open. The hinges groaned, but held. Inside, the stench hit him first. Sour milk, bleach, and something foul enough to twist the stomach. He swept his flashlight beam across the cavernous space. Rows of iron cribs stretched across the floor. Inside them, infants squirmed and whimpered, their cries blending into a haunting chorus. Each tiny body wrapped in thin cloth, faces pale under the sickly light of flickering fluorescent bulbs. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. Rexy gave a low whine, pacing between the rows, his head dipping into each crib as though counting, cataloguing, refusing to leave any unseen. Jack's jaw clenched. Dear God! Before he could move further, a voice rolled from the shadows, deep, mocking. Well, well! Look what crawled back from the rails. From behind the cribs stepped a man, broad-shouldered, bald head gleaming under the light, a jagged scar cutting from cheek to chin. Kane Holt. Jack knew him by reputation, one of the broker's enforcers, brutal and loyal. Kane wasn't alone. Men emerged from the dark, rifles slung across their chests, boots heavy on the concrete. The metallic click of bolts chambering rounds filled the air. Jack raised his Glock, but Kane lifted a hand. Don't. Unless you want the little girl to bleed. Before Jack could react, one of the thugs lunged forward, seizing Emma's arm. She screamed, kicking, but the man pressed a knife against her ribs. Rexy's growl tore through the warehouse, deep and thunderous. His hackles rose, lips curled back to show every white tooth. Jack's trigger finger twitched, but his chest constricted. He couldn't risk Emma. Drop it, Kane barked. Jack let the Glock clatter to the floor, his fury restrained only by the blade against Emma's side. Good dog, Kane mocked, sneering at Rexy. Knows when he's outnumbered. The thug shifted his grip on Emma, tightening. It was a mistake. In a blur of muscle and fury, Rexy launched forward. He struck like a battering ram, jaws clamping around the man's wrist. The knife went skittering across the floor as the thug howled, thrashing against Rexy's relentless bite. Emma dropped low, scrambling away, her breath ragged. Jack dove for his Glock, rolling as gunfire cracked through the warehouse. He fired back, one shot striking true, another slamming into a crate. Sparks and splinters filled the air. Infants wailed louder, their cries rising above the chaos. Rexy tore the thug down, his body a storm of strength and precision. He didn't snap wildly, every movement was controlled, trained by instinct older than war. He released the man only when he stopped struggling, then pivoted, planting himself between Emma and the advancing gunman. Emma, stay behind Rexy! Jack shouted, firing again. A second thug went down, clutching his shoulder. Kane roared, raising his weapon, his massive frame advancing like a predator. You think you can walk in here and steal my merchandise? His voice echoed, fury vibrating in every syllable. Jack fired, but Kane ducked behind a crate, bullets sparking off metal. Another thug fired from the left. Jack rolled, ribs screaming, returning fire. Emma darted towards him, knife in hand, the one the thug had dropped. Her small body moved on instinct more than thought, courage born of desperation. She skidded behind a stack of crates, pressing her back against Jack's. Her chest heaved, but her grip on the blade was firm. Kane's voice thundered again. You can't win, Reynolds. You're one man. You've got a child and a mutt. This is where your story ends. Jack's gaze flicked to Rexy, who stood like a wall of muscle and fur, teeth bared, eyes burning with fire. He wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a soldier, a protector. Jack steadied his aim. His voice was low but fierce. You're wrong. I'm not alone. And as Rexy lunged again into the storm of gunfire, Jack knew the fight had only just begun. The warehouse shook with the staccato thunder of gunfire. The air was thick with smoke, grit, and the metallic tang of blood. Jack Reynolds pressed his back against a crate, his Glock hot in his hand, his ribs screaming every time he drew breath. Across the floor, Kane Holt advanced like a shadow cut from iron, firing in controlled bursts, his scar glinting under the sick light. Emma crouched low behind a stack of pallets, clutching the knife she had snatched earlier. Her eyes were wide, but they didn't freeze. Every sound, every shout, every cry of the babies around her only seemed to sharpen her resolve. Rexy was the storm. The shepherd hurled himself into the fight, barreling into one of Kane's men, his jaws clamping down on an arm until the rifle clattered away. He pivoted with a soldier's precision, his growl rolling deep and furious, his body a living wall shielding Emma. "Emma, stay down!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse, edged with pain. He leaned from cover and fired twice. One bullet struck home. The thug dropped. The second ricocheted off steel, sparks spraying into the dark. Kane sneered, voice booming across the cavern. "You can't save them all, Reynolds!" Not this time, he fired again, and the shot tore into Jack's shoulder, spinning him back against the crate. Fire ripped through his nerves, his breath catching in his throat. "Jack!" Emma cried, instinct pulling her toward him. But Rexy moved faster. The shepherd leapt, intercepting a thug who had broken from Kane's flank. The man slammed a heavy pipe against Rexy's side. The sound cracked like bone. Rexy yelped, his body crumpling for a split second before he dragged himself back up, lips pulled back, blood slicking his fur. Emma scrambled to Jack's side, her hands trembling as she pressed against his wound. "You're bleeding too much." "What do we do?" Jack's face was pale, his jaw tight. "The phone," he gasped. "Emma, do you have a phone?" She froze, then remembered. From her backpack, she pulled out a battered flip phone, half the buttons faded, its hinge cracked. Her fingers shook so badly she almost dropped it. Kane's laugh cut through the chaos. "You think a call will save you? By the time anyone shows, you'll be ash on the floor." Emma ignored him. She punched the numbers with desperate precision. Her voice cracked as she spoke into the receiver. "Help us. Warehouse by the rail yard, babies, please hurry." She left the line open, the background filled with the cries of infants and the sharp cracks of gunfire. Rexy staggered back to her, blood dripping from his side. He stood above her, shoulders squared, growl low and constant. Even wounded, he never wavered. His amber eyes locked on Kane, daring him closer. Kane leveled his weapon, snarling. "I'll end that mutt first." He never got the chance. From the distance came the wail of sirens, sharp, rising, slicing through the night. Red and blue lights flashed against the grimy windows, painting the warehouse in streaks of defiance. Kane's head snapped toward the sound. Fury twisted his scarred face. "Fall back!" he barked at his men. But panic had already spread. Some dropped their weapons and bolted for the shadows. Others froze under the sound of boots pounding toward the doors. The side entrances burst open. Uniformed officers poured in, rifles raised, voices commanding. "Drop it!" On the ground now. Chaos erupted. Kane fired one last volley, then shoved a crate aside, disappearing through a hidden side exit before Jack could line up his shot. Jack staggered to his feet, blood seeping through his shirt, his gun still clutched tight. He wanted to chase Kane, to finish it, but his body betrayed him. His knees buckled, forcing him down. Emma dropped beside him, eyes wet but fierce. "Don't move!" They're here now. All around them, officers rushed to the cribs, lifting babies into their arms, cradling them with hurried tenderness. The cries of infants filled the air, but this time they were answered. Nurses and medics streamed in behind the officers, blankets and stretchers in hand. Rexy collapsed onto his haunches, his chest heaving. Emma pressed her face against his bloodied fur, whispering, "You saved me. You saved all of them." The shepherd's tail thumped weakly, a soldier's salute, even in exhaustion. Jack looked at the two of them, Emma's small body curled against Rexy's battered frame, and felt something break open inside him. Not despair, relief. His voice was ragged, barely audible over the storm of sirens and shouts. "We did it!" Outside, Kane vanished into the night, but the ring he served had shattered. Dozens of children were carried into the waiting ambulances, their lives reclaimed from the dark. Inside the warehouse, among the smell of gunpowder and rust, Emma held Rexy close, and Jack, broken, bleeding, but alive, let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, hope had won a round. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and polish, the kind of place where decisions hung heavier than air. Reporters lined the benches, their pens scratching, cameras waiting for the headline moment. Mothers sat clutching blankets that once swaddled children now safe in their arms. Fathers kept rigid jaws, holding tears back. Jack Reynolds stood near the front, his arm still wrapped in bandages, his suit jacket stiff over healing ribs. Emma Collins sat beside him, her small frame swallowed in a borrowed dress, hair brushed but stubbornly falling across her freckles. Rexy lay at Jack's feet, massive head resting on his paws, amber eyes never leaving the aisle that led to the accused. The traffickers shuffled in chains, heads down, but Kane Holt was not among them. His escape lingered like a shadow, a reminder the fight wasn't finished. Still, dozens of his men had been captured, and the evidence recovered was damning. Judge Ellen Harper, silver-haired and unsparing, read the verdict in a voice that carried like stone across water. These crimes strike at the very core of humanity. This court sentences the defendants to life without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck. The chains rattled as guards led the men away. For the first time in months, the cries of the children were answered not with silence, but with justice. Emma's small hand slipped into Jack's. He squeezed once, steady, a silent promise. Rexy's tail thumped once against the floor, a soldier's acknowledgement that the battle was won, even if the war continued. Afterward, outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Lieutenant Reynolds, how does it feel to finally bring this ring down?" Jack met their cameras with tired eyes. It wasn't just me. A little girl and her dog saved lives. They're the real story. Emma blushed, pressing into his side. Rexy stood taller, his chest broad, ears sharp against the clamour. For a moment, the shepherd looked every inch the guardian he had become. Not a police K-9 on duty, but something more. Weeks later, spring broke over Kansas City. A modest two-story house stood at the edge of town, its porch swing creaking in the breeze. Inside, laughter replaced silence. Emma's drawings filled the fridge, scribbles of trains, stars, and a German shepherd with eyes too wise to be just a dog. Jack signed the last of the papers at the dining table. Emma Collins was now under his temporary guardianship, a step that felt less like legal duty and more like destiny. That night, Emma curled beneath blankets in her new room, exhaustion softening her breath until it was steady, safe. The glow of a nightlight painted her freckles gold. At the doorway, Rexy stretched across the threshold, his body forming a barrier no intruder could cross. His amber eyes glowed faint in the dark, unblinking, a sentinel sworn to his post. Jack lingered at the hall, leaning against the frame. His shoulder still ached, scars still raw, but for the first time in years, the weight in his chest eased. He whispered into the quiet, words meant only for the two who had dragged him back from despair. "We made it." Rexy flicked his ears, thumped his tail once as if he understood. Emma stirred, smiling in her sleep. The house settled into silence, but not the hollow kind Jack once knew. This was a silence filled with peace, trust, and the unspoken vow that they were a family now. And to anyone watching, listening, or remembering, there was one last truth that lingered. Stories like these aren't just about survival. They're about loyalty that doesn't ask questions, courage that comes in the smallest hands, and the bond between a child, a man, and a dog that redefines what it means to be safe. What's your story with a loyal pet? Share it below, and if you believe German Shepherds like Rexy deserve to be honored as the heroes they are, support this channel and keep these stories alive.